Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Let's start with the salute to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Good to see the masses that are here for our meeting. And again, sorry we're starting late, but it's we have both Mr. and Mr. Wizard here, so we had a little technical difficulty, but we're here. With that, I would call on our clerk, Mr. Drake, to move the routine applications.
Thank you. I'd like to move, pardon me for that, item PS1, parking services, $38,000 item, which is a transfer related to rental, automotive, and construction equipment. I'm going to read them all, right, which we'd like. The second item is PL1, Perrott Library, a $20,000 item transfer, which relates to snow removal from parking areas. The third item is item number PD4 in the police department, $21,014, which is an approval to use personal protective equipment. The fourth item is PD5, police department, $180,623, which is approval to use, purchase, install, and train a remote operated vehicle. And the fifth item is SE4 in the First Selectman's office, which we identify the amount now, which is $7,500, which is an additional appropriation to settle De La Valley versus the town of Greenwich. So I move these 5 items.
I'd second those items.
Okay, the item's been moved and seconded. Discussion? All those in favor?
In favor.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. I would call on for our first non-routine item, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, I move CC2 for the Conservation Department, approval to use $217,088 for hazard mitigation grant.
I second that.
Seconded by Mr. Raymer. Committee report followed by discussion.
The Budget Committee reviewed the Conservation Department request for approval to use this federal grant, which is administered through the state for $217,000 for one homeowner's hazard mitigation project to raise their home. The grant equals 75% of the total cost of their project, and the homeowner will submit construction invoices on a quarterly basis through the town for until they complete the project for reimbursement from the state. The committee did vote 4-0 to approve this item.
Discussion, further discussion? Ms. Wesley.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like just to note that I am an applicant for an elevation grant under this program. You received a list the other day, the house in Riverside, which is on that list. I did talk to the town attorney as to whether there would be a conflict by voting tonight, and he said no, because I'm an applicant and this is not my house, but I just wanted everyone on the BET to be aware of that.
Thank you. Further discussion, Mr. Raymer.
I think that we should be aware of what's coming, and we should focus on the labor input that's going to go into this. These are 25, at this point, 25 different applicants. Each one of these applications are probably factually somewhat different. Properties do tend to be unique. The nature of the ways in which each of these properties was damaged by these storms was also unique. From what little I know about it, I believe that the application process is complicated both in the factual inputs required and in the procedures that are involved. The state also dictates a not uncomplicated process by which the application has to be made by the applicant through the town then forwarding it. The state will come back to the town for answers to questions, which the town will then have to field with the applicants. I can see that there is an extraordinarily high level of expertise on behalf of the town that has to be brought to try and have each of these applicants put the correct information at the correct way at the correct time before the state. I can think of no more right-minded thing for a municipality to be doing than to be taking these people who've suffered terrible, grievous losses and help them to be able to find ways to mitigate these losses in the future and to avail themselves of this kind of grant money. I guess that's what I should be calling it, grant money, FEMA money, to subsidize them in this terrible hour of need for them. But nobody should make a mistake but recognize the fact that there is going to be a very large labor input by our conservation department to be able to field all this information, get it put to the right people at the right time in the right way with the right backup documentation. I think we're looking at a very large piece of work. And I'm sure that we'll be grateful in the end that we did it. For sure, I can think of 25 applicants that are going to be very grateful that we did it. But nobody should underestimate the labor that's going to be involved. I'm aware that in the budgetary process, in our infinite wisdom, we were reluctant to try and take a part-timer and expand that part-timer to become a full-timer. I have a feeling that we may be seeing interim requests from the Conservation Department. I've had no dialogue with the Conservation Department about it, but I could see the possibility that they're going to discover that they need some additional manpower if this service is going to be properly rendered, and we may be looking at interim requests during the upcoming year of some additional manpower to help them execute it. And again, I'm going to say for the second time, I think is exactly what a right-minded municipality should be doing. I'm sure these people will be deeply grateful. I think it's exactly what we need to be doing, but I think it's going to be a sizable piece of work. In dialogue in caucus, very bright Mary Kiernan raised the question, and I think it's a right question to raise. Forgive me, Mary Lee, if I'm speaking for you. That given that once we get past the 2 Irene applicants and are looking at the 23 Superstorm Sandy applicants, it may be that they're in a fairly predictable pat amount. And it may not be necessary for us to be entertaining 25 BET requests for approval of grant funding. It may be that we could do the others in a blanket authorization to the Conservation Commission. But the fact that we can do it in one foul swoop doesn't mean that the Conservation Commission is going to be executing these applications in one foul swoop. This is going to be a very picayune, item-by-item, broken window, soaked couch, soppy carpet, one-by-one process of processing these applications. It's going to be a lot of work, but I think it's work that these people desperately need us to do for them.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
I will note that in our Budget Committee hearing with Mr. Raymer and Ms. Tarkenton and Ms. Kiernan, sorry, we did talk about that and the number of applications that may be coming to our committee, and we were going to at least approve this one, send it to the full BET, and then kind of work with Denise and others best way to handle the additional mitigation requests. I will note that I did talk to Michael Rosen in the First Selectman's office today, and there are other people there to hopefully help and coordinate with the head of our conservation department to work through those applications and move them along through the town system, including members of the building department. So yes, a lot of good work, and there will be work, and hopefully others in the town hall will help out.
Mike, Mr. Chairman, I'll just echo what Mark and Jeff had said, but also point out that I think we need maybe a little guidance from Roland, Mr. Geiger, Mr. Minarski on how this is going to flow through finance, because the town is just a conduit here. We're not out any money in this process, and so in order to simplify it, I'm hoping to hear some guidance from you as well as to the easiest way for both the Budget Committee and the BET to handle this going forward. It doesn't have to be tonight, but leading into this next group, and they may come in waves, we want to simplify this as much as possible.
Mr. Goldrick.
I would just like to echo Ms. Kiernan's words here. we're a coastal community. I think there was a report that came out recently that stated that New England was being hit harder by sea level rise than the rest of the country, and we would continue to be hit harder than the rest of the country. And these are federal funds, so we want to be in a position to facilitate the flow of these federal funds to the greatest extent possible, because this is only going to get worse. If anybody's seen Denise Savageau's charts of where our coastline is going to go over the next several years, we know that there are only going to be more people affected, not less. And if I recall the conversation properly, it seemed to me that the bulk of the processing, the bulk of the work was actually with the federal government and the state, not with the town itself. I wonder if it seemed that the documents that were needed by the town were going to be there anyway, for the most part. Have I got that wrong, or do we have a significant role to play here? Because I thought Ms. Savageau was saying that basically we need to approve this so that the federal government can get going.
Good evening, welcome.
Good evening, Denise Savageau, Conservation Director. Just quickly, where we are with the process is it is in, obviously, the federal government's to do the final approval, but the application process itself and the details of the application process, that really is with the town working very closely with each applicant. There's a lot of information that has to be provided to the government in order to process the application. So the government is responsible, in the federal government and the state government is responsible for obviously dotting their I's and crossing their T's. They have a fiduciary responsibility to the people of the United States in terms of how the money is allocated, but they work very closely, and the reason that this program comes through municipal government is they feel that municipal governments are really on the front lines when it comes to mitigation, hazard mitigation, and identifying areas where we should be doing this. So, for example, in our Plan of Conservation and Development, we have identified Old Greenwich as an area where we want to do hazard mitigation work and where we want to make sure that we maintain our real estate values and have a resilient community by helping people elevate the homes. So that's how they engage the municipality. Right now, we've done a bulk of the work, and so our work really at this point will be, shepherding it through, making sure that invoices are, transmitted through appropriately for reimbursement. Like I said, the application process, and we've probably actually done the bulk of the work through the application process, and now we have a workload just, monitoring that. I did want to, and I know Mark had spoken with Michael Rosen, but I also talked with the building department and with our zoning board of appeals department and whatever. Every single one of these applications is going to have to go through that process. So that's the process within the town. Now, whether or not they received a grant, they would have to go through the same process. If you're going to elevate your home in town, you have to go. So that's the building department. We're going to be coordinating with them. They're going to be there anyway, so it's just a matter of, okay, is the work being done? They're regulating it anyway from a building department, permitting perspective. And that's one of the reasons that the government also looked at the hazard mitigation grant program working this way, because it is up to the local planning and zoning, the local building departments to enforce those floodplain regulations. And so using those departments, we have easy access to make sure that everyone is in compliance with what those buildings are requiring, because in order to complete the work and say that they are now in compliance with the floodplain regulations, forget about the grant part. Just being in compliance with the floodplain regulations, that's where everybody wants to be for their insurance purposes and whatever. For the town to say, yes, you're in compliance with those floodplain regulations, that's the intent of this program. So once they do that, the applicant, the resident will be able to say, yes, my home is, and they'll be able to get their insurance rates that, appropriately so in terms of have the peace of mind that they're now more resilient, that they won't be able to flood. And, and that's the easiest way, therefore, then for the town to be able to say, yes, we're going to say that these funds are being expended correctly, because at the end of the day, they will have a CO from our building department that says, yes, you're in compliance. So and I probably didn't make that quite as clear, and I do thank you for last Wednesday. I was a little bit under the weather, so I probably may not have been as clear about some things as I should have been. So anyway, Thank you.
Further discussion? Okay. CC2, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. That moves us to item 3, the assessor's report. Good evening. Good.
Members of the BET. I would like to present the assessor's report for April 2016. I really don't have too much to report this evening. We are currently in the process of still accepting our senior state and local property tax relief applications. Those will be due by May 15th. If we have not received applications by the end of the month, we will then.
Microphone. There you go.
in front of your face so you're speaking to it.
If we don't receive, if any of the seniors have not come in by the end of this month, we will be personally calling all these people to make sure they comply with their with the application. We are currently starting our next project, which is to update the ProVal CAMA system. Now that we have a new IT director, we will be meeting with him tomorrow and hopefully get that underway within the next couple of weeks as well. So that's basically all I'm bringing on at the moment. Does anybody have any questions?
Those numbers that we get for the 15th, do we use those in the mill rate calculation? Do we adjust those at the very end or no?
At the VAA?
No, for all the tax credit. Do we look at the applications?
We've already budgeted.
We've already budgeted.
Budgeted, but the problem is the numbers in May is they continue to be adjusted into the summer. Even
Okay.
After the bills go out, people can still come back, I believe, and there's adjustments made.
Yeah, there are. There's
Okay.
a couple of things that happen.
Okay, just checking. Anything else? I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we accept the assessor's report.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Mr. Finger. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Thank you very much. Item number 4. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. This is not working. Good evening, Mr.
It's working.
It's working.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. Controller's Report. The page 1 under risk management, good news. As reported earlier, the settlement on the insurance claim was for $2.6 million. And with a $200,000 deductible, we got 2.4, and there was a small settlement on engine number 5 from the fire department. The breakdown, which was requested, is listed on page 1. General fund getting $1,034,000, the capital non-recurring, golf course, sewer maintenance, and the parking fund. The sewer maintenance and the parking fund were prorations because they had small appropriations. So some of this was prorated. On the golf course, the 362 is all trees. It's a complete tree reimbursement. And of note was, if you remember the storm from March of 2010, they actually got $86,000. It was a much, much smaller claim. It was only about 350,000. So they have 2 tree claims. And for a fund as small as this, these are large numbers, the $86,000 and the $362,000. Of note, Dustin Anderson from the First Selectman's Office presented to the BET Budget Committee 2 weeks ago and informed us that we will be getting a check for $1,637,716,000. He said in a week or two, about a week or two ago, so it should be coming any day. That, excuse me?
The audit committee, budget committee.
Oh, I'm sorry, the audit committee. That's for debris removal, and all of that will be applied against the general fund. Of note, and this was at a 75% reimbursable rate by FEMA. Of note is, in his presentation, there's $4.8 million, $4,851,391 that's been applied to FEMA, which would be reimbursed at 100%. However, you've got to back out the insurance proceeds so that you don't double dip, and they amount to about $800,000. So if you ask me a range, I can give you the upper range is $4 million that's out there. We don't expect $4 million, but we expect a couple $1 million to be reimbursed. So as of the receipt of the 1.6, we're at 4.1. Keep in mind that we got over $1 million last year, and it's already been applied to the fund balances. So we're probably going to get well in excess of $5 or $6 million, which basically is making us whole. Because some of these things, snowstorms, hurricanes, we budget normally that they're going to happen. So we're being reimbursed well beyond what was appropriated. And I'll move. Any questions on the insurance claims before I move into the rest of the controller's report? Bill?
Just want to point out that, just for the public, we're not being reimbursed for anything more than we actually spent. So it's a question of what was appropriated, but. Right.
Exactly. You have that's a good point, because FEMA actually comes in and audits. They audit the payrolls, they audit the invoices, and they make sure that the invoices, the expenses, whether it's debris removal or labor in any of the departments applies, is applicable. And they'll look at the timesheets to see that they were done during that time period. Retirement board, there's two items I didn't put in here because they duplicate. They're going to be covered later in the agenda. There's the amendment to the retirement board plan document and the interest rate change to contributions. One final comment, and then I'll move on. The cash flow report is in here every month. It's prepared by the treasurer. What we did this month was we presented to the BET Investment Advisory Committee a basic educational walkthrough of what goes into it. The treasurer, working with myself and Roland Geiger, we spend a lot of time of that, especially at the beginning of the year. Each year we have to reset some of the assumptions, the retirement assumptions, take into account the 5% increase in the budget. That's the expenses, not the mill rate increase. And the big item that's in here that impacts the cash flow the most is the switch over to the new self-insured, fully insured health care plan, which is impacting the first 6 months of this year favorably, the cash flow of about $5 million. So we need a couple of months for this to wash out. And again, this is a report that we spend a lot of time refining, and it's about 6 or 7 years old. I'll stop there if anybody has any questions on the controller's report.
I'll move to accept.
I got one more item. At the request of Chairman of the BET Audit Committee, I inadvertently left out, as part of the internal audit section, was there's an annual event that we do every April at the Audit Committee. We have an annual write-off of bad debts, and usually we used to have bad debts down at the transfer station, but we took away the credit system, and now people either pay cash or pay through credit card, so we don't have any bad debts there. I've handed out a document. It's on the front page. It's Parks and Rec. So for this year, we wrote off $16,016.94. The Parks and Rec department has been working with us for a couple years. They do not let anybody go. They have a hammer in that if you have a bad debt, you can't use any of the town facilities that require a town pass, which is a beach card, a multi-pass. And basically there's 8 here, and the 3 larger ones are the Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, and they're like antique shows that they rent the facilities. And the other 5 are basically small groups, a family of beach cards. So they do everything they can to try to recapture this money. And in the case of the Parks and Rec, they might write it off, but if these people try to come back and some of them move out of town, try to get a beach card, they're flagged in the computer system, and they cannot. They have to pay in full, pay the collection fees to get back into the system or back into the town facilities. The second one, the last page, and the names are redacted for personal reasons. These are patients up at the Nathaniel Witherall. They have a large receivable that's on the books each year, and they have a large doubtful count allowance for doubtful accounts. And they contract with Shipman and Goodman to actually go out and do a search of assets, and they use a collection agency also, where you can see a negative number on the bottom. And each April, they come to the BET Audit Committee, and they ask for the write-offs. So at the request of the chairman of the Audit Committee, I just wanted to point that out, the due diligence the town does in trying to recoup every single dollar that's owed to us. And this is aside from the property tax collections. Question?
Yes, I have a question. Is it Shipman Goodman or Colleen Murtha?
I'm sorry, you're right. It's Murtha, Kalina, Richter, and Penny. Shipman and Goodman is the next topic.
So Pete, just as an example, B&D Antiques owing $8,000 or so, wouldn't they have been required to pay that before they could exhibit at the antique show? Or, I mean, how does something like
Obviously
that?
not. What could happen? I'd have to look at the backup for this. They probably only have, like, if you book a wedding in advance or something, you put a deposit up. I mean, I can get back to you on the procedures.
I'm just curious. I mean, you would think you'd have to pay in full before you're allowed to.
I was going to say that, but I don't publicly want to accuse anybody of bouncing a check.
Yeah, just curious.
What I'll do is I owe it to the BET. I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
I'll make my motion now.
Mr. Norton?
To accept the controller's report.
I have moved by Mr. Norton, seconded by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. Let me continue. I saved that over on that pile. Number 5, acceptance of the treasurer's report for the activity for the past month.
So moved.
I have a motion and by Mr. Norton, seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? That motion is carried. Item number 6, we have some changes here. There's no audit committee report this month. It's most of it that's in the controllers report. Item number 7, do we have anything for liaisons? We'll hear from our retirement liaisons a little bit later on some of the items. But on number 8, special project team, I'm going to call on Central Firehouse. Mr. Johnson first.
Mr. Chairman, just a note here that tomorrow was supposed to have been a groundbreaking ceremony for the construction of the Central Fire Station. However, that date and time has been changed to Tuesday, May 6th at 1:30. So if you show up tomorrow, no one will be there.
Okay, so does everybody have that? May 6th. Roland, can we just get an email to everybody? I'm sure the First Selectman's office will do it, but just make sure, because I'm sure people are going to want to change that in their schedule. So that's May 6th at 1:30. Okay. Misa, you have a report included in your package. Ms. Tarkington?
I'd like to add that if anyone goes over to MISA, they'll see that it's now 27% complete.
Right.
But the most important thing is that last week, the steel contractor brought in a 40-ton crane, and the steel over the green rooms and that whole area on the eastern side of the auditorium has now been erected, and they're bolting that steel in place. So you're beginning to see things above the ground as well as at ground level.
Thank you. Ms. Kieran, Parks and Rec Cottage, just a quick update where we are on that.
Parsonage Cottage.
Parsonage Cottage.
Mr. Chairman, our last meeting, the third of our 3 public meetings, was held on February 21st. The working group, along with Mr. Minarski, Ms. Zerfe, and Ms. Ahmad from the Town Attorney's Office, continues to conduct a lot of diligence and analysis of this matter, and we're hoping to have our next public meeting in the next few weeks.
Good. As before, because the month of May for us, just so you know why I'm calling on some of these, because the month of May is usually the budget and setting the mill rate, so I just want to make sure we have an update where we are. That brings us to item number 9, new business. Mr. Norton.
I presented a Nathaniel Withell Building Committee report.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I want to do a little updating because the construction committee meets every Monday morning, and we met again this morning. And indicated here, because there are 3 dates scheduled with the Department of Public Health for inspections. They have not yet been confirmed, and there's some concern about whether or not we're going to get the dates that we have applied. But there's even a more pressing issue, and that involves the electrical contractor, Anderson, who continues to not have enough men on the job. And we had a prolonged discussion this morning with Turner as to whether or not we're going to need to replace or add another contractor, electrical contractor, to be able to complete some of the stages of the project. We have fallen behind in 2 of them, and one we're actually 2 weeks behind at this point in time. So the dates that I indicated in here, especially the completion date, became a little bit tenuous in the last few days.
Okay. Item 9, new business. I'm going to call on Peter and then I'll call on our retirement liaisons. But I'm going to actually take this to call on Peter for these items.
Yep. Before you, there's a motion at the end of this discussion someone's going to make, and there's going to be a vote on this. And then attached to it, it says the last words are as presented. It's the preamble and the actual changes to the charter in the summary plan document. But what I want to do is just go back amendment number 1 and amendment number 2. There's 12 members here. 3 of the members were not here in September of 2012 when we approved amendment number 1. The IRS requires us to be in compliance with the IRS code as far as the retirement summary plan document. And back in January 27th of 2011, the former retirement administrator, Jim Lavin, Shipman and Goodman, and the actuary at the time was EFI, worked with the IRS to come up with a favorable determination letter. And there was a lot of back and forth between the town and the IRS to come up with a favorable determination letter. They did come up with a favorable determination letter in July 30th, 2012. And one of the requirements, again, this is Amendment 1 to the Town Charter, Article 14, was that the town, meaning the BET, had to approve this amendment, which was in September of 2012. The substance of the changes were basically, there's 4 of them. Number 1, the biggest one, was we had to incorporate our collective bargaining agreements going back to 1980. The second one, we were remiss in we didn't have our actuarial assumptions in our plan document, and we didn't have our mortality tables in our plan document. I'll get back to them too. So all of these, the mortality tables, the actuarial assumptions, the updating of the collective bargaining were all incorporated, and we had 90 days to approve it, and we meaning the BET, approved it September of 2012. Amendment number 2, all 12 of you were here, was last July. You recall the oversight by Ira Hoffman, I believe his name is, from Goldman, Ira Goldman from Shipman and Goodman, where they had an oversight, and there was a section in there that did not apply to governments. It was the early distributions, and this board, the BET, approved that section, the change, amendment number 2, in July of last year. And basically, that was oversight, that was housekeeping. The majority of the work was done 2 years ago on September 12, bringing the plan document into compliance with the IRS. Tonight, what we're doing, again, it's housekeeping. And again, you've got attached here is the basic changes to the summary plan document. What we're doing at the recommendation of Transamerica and the actuary is we're using more modern mortality tables. People are living longer, and we're updating the mortality tables, which is change number 1. And change number 2 is number 5 is the actuarial equivalent interest rate assumption, which is 7.25. We were using 8%. This is not the same as the assumed rate of return, which we've been ratcheting down from 8.5 to 8 to 7.75, et cetera, to get to 7. So basically, all you're doing tonight is you're amending for the 3rd time the summary plan document to bring us in compliance with the IRS code. Now, I'll either answer questions or turn it over to the BET Investment Advisory Committee or for report or...
That's where I was going to go next.
Okay.
But that helped. Mr. Drake.
Thank you. Mr. Minarski explained the background of this very well. The changes that he noted on the mortality table are required under the IRS rules to conform with what a plan document must have, and so it's an obligation on us. And the second matter of changing the actuarial equivalent interest rate, again, we wrote it in our brief report, but when employees with a deficiency in their account retire, it's just, they would have, some employee have a deficiency of X, the monthly pension equivalent of that, the monthly amount of Y gets deducted from their theoretical full pension just to keep the integrity of the math. And so, in effect, the town, the retirement plan is funded by the town and by the employees. The town is funding it based on an assumed annual rate of return of 7.25%. And so it's appropriate that the underages that an employee would have in his balance are used as the same math. So in effect, that's what we're doing here. And our committee voted 3-0-0, because Mr. Blankley wasn't there that day, I'm sorry, to approve these actions taken by the retirement board.
So that would be my question. So the retirement board has approved these two resolutions. They voted in favor of them.
It did.
This is one.
The retirement board did, and the investment advisory committee voted 3-0
This
to
item.
approve that action.
They 5-0 on this item. That's a different answer for the next item. the next
Okay,
vote.
so the first one is the motion for the amendment 2014-1.
Right.
So the retirement board voted 5-0-0, and the retirement, our investment advisory voted 3-0-0. Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Drake, I would think, unless I have any other conversation, we would want to move the first motion. Could you?
Yes, you're right, it's appropriate for me to make the motion, so I'm happy to make the motion that's before you. This brief one here, like Mr. Minarski says, ends with as presented.
Okay, so it's a motion to adopt amendment number 3, 2014-1, to the Town of Greenwich Supplemental Retirement System provisions pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code as presented.
At the committee.
And Mr. Norton reminds us that since it's a committee making this, you don't need a second, I think.
Okay. Discussion. Let me start writing, Mr. Raymer, Ms. Tarkington.
Will it follow, Mr. Minarski, that if we're now going to be operating the retirement fund based upon a set of mortality tables that anticipates a longer life, then the anticipated benefit expense will become a little bit greater? Do we have an issue now as to whether or not the funding that we've budgeted will now no longer be sufficient to meet what we thought we were meeting sufficiently before?
The answer is the liability will go up. I don't believe it's be material, and we can document for you what the impact will be. He does that when he meaning Greg Stump, the actuary, does all the ins and outs, ups and downs, the changes. He'll quantify what this change will be, and I could probably give back to the BET if you want that before you want for the next report, the impact on this change. It's somewhere out there. I just didn't bring it with me tonight.
We have an obligation under our charter to be contributing into the system based upon some actuarial assumptions and things.
Correct.
A sum which is generally liquidating our obligation going forward.
Yes.
And so now if I change the mortality table, does our charter require that we amend the appropriation for the upcoming year to a higher number?
No. Yes and no. The answer is the actuary report was effective as of July 1st of 2013 using pension census data at that date, not using these tables. That presents, by charter, an arc that you have to fund. The arc follows the actuary report by a full year. So that arc is 14-15. This will be incorporated in, and it'll show up in the July 1st, 2014 actuary report, which will be the arc for 14-15.
15-16.
15-16. You're right, 15-16.
Next fiscal year.
Yeah.
Ms. Tarkington?
My question was similar. I was going to ask whether this would impact the unfunded liability. So,
Yes.
Again, using this actuarial report that we're currently using, I would like to know what that new number would be.
Yes. Also, just to follow up on it, they do experiences studies, and they actually, as part of it, they determine, as part of the actual report, when people are dying in reality. So when people are getting disabled retirements in reality. So they adjust their report based on every 5 years an experience study on the assumptions, et cetera. So that one could potentially wash out the other. He's projecting over the next 20, 30 years, but if in fact the people are dying quicker or slower or something like that, he already takes that into effect through the experience study.
Thank you.
Mary Lee Kernan?
Pete, the wording of the actuarial assumptions that are going to be included in the retirement plan, there's a gender split, and that is based on the gender split in the particular workforce, in the population we're looking at. I mean, typically, mortality tables are different by gender.
Correct. Yes. Women in the mortality tables live, I think, about 2 years longer.
Right.
But it also breaks it down here by category.
Correct.
Police and fire.
So, for example, under fire and police, it's 90% male, 10% female, because that is the population
Composition of the workforce.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion. It's been seconded. If there's no further discussion, this is on the first motion. So all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Okay. That brings us to the next one.
History?
I'd like to get it moved first, and then I'll call it. So if you would.
Again, sure. You have a motion before you, and that a motion to approve changing the interest rates applied to contribution balances. Our committee examined this and again voted 3-0 to approve this action that was taken by the retirement board. So I'll move the motion that's before you.
On behalf of the committee.
On behalf of the committee.
Okay, discussion. Peter, if you seem to flag me off.
Let me do the history first. In the summer of July 1st of 2010, let me back up. In the spring of 2010, the BET approved a change in the interest rate applied to employee contributions, which affects the employee contributions. Let's say that you hire Joe or Jane Doe. They contribute to the plan, and they leave after 3 years. They take out their contributions, or if somebody retires, they have a deficiency. The rate that was being used for decades was 7.5%. We had the 2008-2009 nosedive in the stock market, and the retirement board felt it wasn't fair that the people were earning 7.5%, and the fund was not doing as well, and thought that the rate should have been adjusted. So the BET approved this change, which was recommended and approved by the retirement board, effective July 1st, 2010. And in the motion, I put in some numbers for you. What they used was we decided, I'm being as one of the trustees, we decided to use the 5-year note. And back then, it was around 267. And in the subsequent years, it went down to as low as 68 basis points. We have 2 members on the retirement board of public safety who took offense to this. They thought it was too low. It wasn't fair to their members that were contributing, and their contributions were not getting the old 7.5%. They were currently getting 267, and it kept going down to 6.8. There was dissension amongst the members, and we decided last summer to keep the rate using the 5-year Treasury at the end of April at that rate, and then we would move it. We decided to compromise and change it. And as a compromise, Larry Simon worked with the fire person as a trustee, Kevin Coyner, to come up with a new rate, a higher rate. I use the word compromise because the police captain and the fire official were not happy with the new rate. So what we did is retirement board voted to go from a 5-year to a 10-year. And if you use last Thursday's numbers, you could see that the 10-year was 273, the 5-year was 175. So if there was no change, the 68 basis points at the end of, assuming this is the same rate at the end of April, would be 1.75, which they thought was unfair. The compromise was that we would use a minimum of 3% at the end of April, and we would use the 10-year rate, but you could see that it's still not approaching the 3%. So if this was the end of April, the 273 would ratchet up to 3% minimum, and in the future years, unless we come before you again to change this, it would be capped at the assumed rate, which is going to be next year at 7%, which we don't know when it'll ever reach that. So again, we're changing the rate, we're increasing it, and I believe you got in your packages the impact. The impact is very favorable to the plan because the lower rate, people with deficiencies are benefiting to the tune of, did you all get that in the conclusion?
Yeah, the
where
boomer
if
sign.
we move it like 2%, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, the pension plan benefits. And then the offset to the contributors still getting lower rates is, whether it's a refund or a disability retirement, is a lot lower. So based on the actuary's analysis, we decided to use a higher rate, and that's what is proposed tonight before you in the form of a motion.
Okay, so the investment advisory, you said they were 3-0 on that. Where was the retirement board on this?
3-2.
In favor.
The police and the two representatives. There's 5 members.
Yep.
2 of them are chosen by yourself, the first selectman and RTM moderator, per charter, a voting ex officio member. There's 2 elected officials, and the police and the fire have strong lobbies, and they get the votes out. And Captain Court, I've been here 10 years. He's been on the board for the same 10 years.
So it was 3 in favor, 2 against.
The two, in support of their union people, voted against it. The 2 public safety officials voted against this. They wanted a higher rate.
Got it.
They wanted to they didn't come up with a definitive number, but they wanted to use like a taxable 10-year corporate bond rate or something like that, which would be a couple hundred basis points higher.
Got it. I'm sorry, Mr. Finger?
So you start off by saying that the compromise still resulted in a split vote of 3-2?
Let me back up and to explain why it's a compromise. This has been going on for years. It's been going on since 2010. And as they watch it go down from 267 to 68, they have been complaining. They're concerned. They want the rate's too low, and they wanted a higher rate. So as a compromise, Mr. Simon and Mr. Coiner went offline and tried to come up with the rate. This is the compromise. The compromise is we're not using the 5-year note. We're using the 10-year. We have a minimum of 3%. So that's what the compromise was.
But did they vote on that? Did they need to vote on?
They voted against it.
So they still voted against it,
Correct.
even though Mr. Coiner and Mr. Simon came up with something else.
Actually,
offline.
no. They didn't actually finalize it. That was the compromise is, well, actually, technically it's not a compromise. They voted against it. Now I understand what you're saying.
Okay. Further discussion? Okay. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Thank you, Peter, for getting us through that one. That one, let me just put this in my pile here. Okay. Okay, approval of resolutions. So, in front of you, everybody has a fresh copy of the resolutions. Now, the last time we were dealing with these resolutions, we were 7 hours plus into a meeting, and then we had minutes after that. So, as I remember it, I called for the resolutions, all of the resolutions that were carried forward. And then we spoke about ones that there were changes, and I think I referenced that the law committee had been through these. And I believe Ms. Weissler called for the revised number on the bonding resolution. Roland, help me.
Put the candy away.
So I actually was under the impression, except for the motion that we decided to postpone, we've gone through these. So what I did tonight was, and Roland will sort of explain this, all the resolutions are before us tonight, so we can kind of do this. So, but Roland watched the video. We just couldn't get the link out of his computer to send it to everyone.
One question is, when you said, Nancy said, let's vote on what about the bonding resolutions? We have the revised number based upon the changes made to the capital plan. And we voted on that, and you said the rest of them, and it's unclear whether the rest of them meant the rest of the bonding resolutions or the rest of the resolutions.
So in this process of did we or did we not, I mean, Mr. Johnson was sick that night. Mr. Finger was sick that night, so they're no help. They were just cough medicine and things keeping them going because, it was getting late. So what I'm going to do is we have the resolutions before us, and what I will ask is a little bit of a, I just need to find the two resolutions that were number 10. I would like to make a motion that we approve the resolutions except for resolution number 10 and number 48. Let's start simple there. Can I get a motion, Mr. Raymer?
Mr. Chairman, can we just, point of clarification, so it's the numbered resolutions that are the non-bonding resolutions, correct?
Correct.
Numbered 1 through 52?
Yeah, I'll tell you what the numbers are. Okay. What I plan on doing is resolutions, bonding resolution, and go back for the other two.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, but in response to Ms. Kiernan's question, the numbered resolutions are 1 through 52.
Thank you.
Before you, except for excluding for the moment resolution 10 and 48, which we'll come back to in a moment.
Okay, so I have a motion.
But does that include the additional resolutions that we have?
After number 52.
We have additional resolutions that go beyond those numbers, and I believe that we normally would always approve those at the same time. And I think that's what Mr. Raymer meant to say.
You take numbers away from this board, and we really, okay.
It's right there.
I think, Mr. Raymer, it's the bonding resolution that she's.
No, it's not. It's the additional resolutions that include the HR resolutions and the other resolutions that we have just beyond number 52, but we don't number them as such. We call them additional provisions.
Okay.
Should we be numbering?
Okay, so Mr. Raymer, your resolution is to include resolutions 1 through 51, and then
1 through 52.
1 through 52.
Excluding 10 and 48.
And
And also, with some assistance from my colleague, the additional provisions which appeared, let me just see if they're in the handout.
They are. They are.
So the pages aren't numbered, but it's the 2 pages that follow.
Now therefore
number
it be
52.
resolved.
Follow 52.
Yes.
Okay. Seconded by Ms. Tarkington. Okay, discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Resolution's made it twice, Roland. Okay. The next one, Mr. Raymer, I will call on you for the authorization for borrowings.
No, we've already approved those, I believe, at the previous meeting.
I thought we did too.
We're doing it again.
Well, I would move they be approved if necessary for a second time.
And I second, I think Mr. Raymer meant without that last clause, and I second that motion.
Okay. So,
Question.
Mr. Finger?
So Roland, the amount of $39,269,000, that's the correct number? Okay.
And then,
But there's a one that follows, Bill, for the MESA,
and then
too.
the Mises 2.370,
Right.
correct? And the 2.530 for the various sewerage. Okay, so there's 3 borrowing resolutions. Okay. Further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Abstaining? Okay. Item number 10 on the resolutions. Thank you for leaving this out. Roland, am I to understand that the Harbor Management Commission changed its name, and that's what this is about?
That's correct. We had an advisory committee before, now we have a commission.
Yeah, it's not a change of name, but it's a replacement body. And if it would assist the board, I'll mention that I was curious whether or not the advisory committee has any continued existence, and I received an email from our first selectman advising me that the Harbor Management Advisory Committee no longer exists and that it's been replaced by the commission. It's new people, it's a new body, and so the resolution 10 that you have before you that talked about an authorization that it doesn't. This one actually doesn't speak about the committee, but the new replacement resolution, which I disseminated, will now make reference to the Harbor Management Commission, and at their request, they wanted me to also to include language which referred to the Harbor Management Commission ordinance, which they've also enacted. And so you have before you, as a separate handout, the proposed replacement resolution for paragraph 10.
Okay.
I'll read it if you wish.
Please.
The Board of Selectmen, through the Harbor Management Commission, is authorized pursuant to Town Charter Section 307 and the Harbor Management Commission ordinance to collect proceeds from the issuance of mooring permits within the Greenwich Harbor area, and such proceeds shall become appropriations upon approval by the Board of Estimate and Taxation to be used for the maintenance and enhancement of the town's coastal resources.
Okay. And so we have that moved and seconded. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Where's my next piece of paper? That was 10, 48. Mr. Raymer, I will call on you if you want to move the new 48 and move it, and we'll give a committee report. And
there's been a little offline dialogue going on between Mrs. Tarkington and myself, so I'm going to have to do this as a two-step operation. In accordance with an email that I dispatched, I'm going to move the following resolution. Mrs. Tarkington, I believe, will be proposing a small amendment to it, which I will gladly support. But for a starting place, let me read the resolution, the proposed resolution, as I had disseminated to the members of this board by email in the last few days. It was a resolution that had been drafted by Assistant Town Attorney Amina Ahmad. It reads as follows. The Department of Parks and Recreation Tree Division is authorized to accept A, gifts of trees and plantings from the Greenwich Tree Conservancy, INC, and B, donations of planting services of landscape contractors paid for by the Greenwich Tree Conservancy, INC, for the planting of trees and plantings to be planted on town property under the authorization and supervision of the tree warden. May I have a second for that, and then we'll discuss perhaps the amendment.
seconded by Mr. Finger. Okay. Discussion on the motion, or you, Ms. Tarkington, if you'd like, you can make a motion to amend.
Yes, I would like to make a motion to amend. The Department of Parks and Recreation Tree Division will submit a report to the BET annually summarizing these contributions.
And for the sake of showing unity, I would like the privilege of seconding that motion for amendment.
Okay. Before I call discussion, 1 second. We have that. Okay. Discussion on the motion to amend.
Just added language, is that all?
Just added language.
It's adding an additional sentence at the end. I don't know that Mrs. Tarkington said that, but that was the intent.
Yes, it was adding an additional sentence at the end.
Okay.
To provide reporting of the information, whether they are gifts of trees or whether they're gifts of plantings to the town, so that there would be some record within the Board of Estimate and Taxation. It could be at any point in time, probably during the annual budget process would be the most likely time.
Okay. Okay. Discussion on the motion to amend?
I think some history might be appropriate here. When we were discussing at our last BET meeting this particular paragraph 48, there were some questions that were raised, and it led in the end to a motion by Mr. Drake to put this back to the Law Committee for the obtaining of some further factual information. That motion was seconded and passed by the BET, and so it did come back to the Law Committee for that purpose. I think so that I can get past this question of whether or not there's facts which we don't know answers to. I want to take a few minutes, if I can, to run through the underlying facts of what's going on here so that all the members of the board will have certain facts available to them when they vote on this item. Is that an appropriate way for me to proceed, Mr. Chairman?
I think so. I mean, we do have a motion on the amendment. We should vote on the amendment. But I would say I think
I will hold those thoughts.
I think that
Let's vote on the amendment.
will pass by unanimous consent. So I will say keep right on going here because I want. This was one that I don't think we put a lot of time into because of the hour last time.
Indeed. And there were some issues that were raised, and some of the issues that were raised are fair comment that should be explained. And there are other issues raised that I think were concerns that we needn't concern ourselves with, but I think I need to be careful to respond to each of these things. So let me review some history. On the 13th of March, the Law Committee met for the purpose of reviewing all of these resolutions. And very sharp-witted Mrs. Tarkington focused on this paragraph 48 with three concerns that she articulated that I knew nothing about at the time. First, she pointed out that although the resolution as it existed at that moment was authorizing the town to receive gifts of trees or donations for the purchase of trees, Mrs. Tarkington pointed out that at some point the arrangement had flip-flopped and the Conservancy was no longer making gifts of trees or money with which to buy trees. The town was buying its own trees, and that the planting was being done by the Conservancy, and there was no authorization in our resolutions for the gifts of those planting services. Secondly, Mrs. Tarkington pointed out that she understood that there was some concern at the Department of Public Works that the placement of some of these trees were in places that were disturbing sight lines, and the Department of Public Works had expressed a concern about that. And so Mrs. Tarkington was concerned that there be appropriate supervision to be sure that trees are being planted in correct places and to be sure that we know who, in fact, is making those decisions. The third and last point that Mrs. Tarkington raised at that point was that she had the understanding that there was an obligation by Parks and Recreation to be reporting back to the BET at least semi-annually on the planting of trees, and that had not been honored. Those were certainly serious concerns, and I raised them with this board when we came to pass on these items at our meeting on the 20th of December, which is the point of Mr. Drake's motion, tossed the matter back to the Law Committee appropriately to get answers to some of these questions. The following day, I received an email from a nice lady by the name of Joanne Messina at the Tree Conservancy asking me what information I would require. I didn't solicit this email from her. She must have been watching television or present at the meeting or some otherwise cued. And so I asked her some questions. I asked her to please confirm to me factually from the standpoint of the Tree Conservancy, please confirm back to me who pays for the cost of the trees. And she responded back that Bruce Payman selects and purchases all trees, Bruce Payman being our tree warden. I asked, secondly, who selects the places at which each and every tree is planted, and she responded back to me that each and every location of tree planting is selected by Bruce Payman. They do no planting at places on their own. Bruce Payman, our tree warden, selects every single location. I asked who selects the contractors that are being used, and she responded back to me that the Tree Conservancy is selecting the contractors, but they're using contractors that have prior experience with the town and are paying at the same town rates. So they were making the assumption that the selection would be acceptable to the town. And then last I asked, is there any remitting by the town directly, or is there any reimbursements being made to the town? And she responded back to me, no, they're paying the contractors, the town is buying the trees. There's no financial reimbursement taking place to the town from the Tree Conservancy whatsoever. On the 24th, I received the draft from Amin Ahmad of the resolution that I initially put before you without Mrs. Tarkington's amendment. And the Law Committee, responding to your request, then met for a second time on the 10th of April. And at that time, Mrs. Tarkington raised a fourth concern, and that was that she had some informal information that there may have been some grievance concerns by some of the union personnel that certain of the planting labor had shifted away from town people over to outside contractors. With those things before us, we asked Bruce Spayman if he would kindly attend the meeting. He was available, and he did come up. And he responded, confirming for the most part facts are already shown to us by the Tree Conservancy, which is to say that the arrangement that had previously existed went through the flip-flop in December of 2013. And the reason for it was that the buildup of backlog of work by the various storms that we've experienced was making it more and more difficult for the town people to continue to do the planting. And the Tree Conservancy was expressing some disappointment and dismay that they were making gifts of trees, but the trees weren't being planted, and they were concerned that the process was running aground. And the Tree Conservancy proposed to them, suppose we do the planting for you and you provide the trees, and that was inaugurated in December 2013. Admittedly, it was never brought back to the BET for authorization of that change. Mr. Spayman confirmed at our meeting that he personally selects and approves each and every location of planting. There's been no planting of any tree that was not of his approved location. Secondly, he selects, because he buys, he selects each and every tree, its size, its species, etc., is all of his own personal selection. He is recommending that the resolution going forward authorizes both processes, that it authorizes the town to accept gifts of trees and also authorizes the town to accept the planting services, because he has the anticipation that the arrangement could conceivably flip-flop again during the upcoming year, and it would be foolish to have to come back a second time when we can approve it now. He indicated that he was not aware of any grievance. On the contrary, he said that he sat down and vetted this with the union people before he inaugurated the change and understood from them that they had no problem with it, so he would be surprised if there was a grievance, and certainly he knew of none. He also indicated that he was not aware of any reporting requirement or any arrangement to come back at least semi-annually, but he says that he has extremely detailed records. At any time that we want, he would be glad to sit down with us and lay out to us every single tree and every single location that has been planted. He has those detailed records. Regarding sight lines, he said that he tries to be sensitive to sight lines. He thinks he has dealt with that well, but if people have difficulties, then he's not aware of them. I made contact with Amy Siebert, who responded back to me that she is aware that at least at an earlier point there was concern about sight line on some of the plantings. She thinks it's prior history, but she wouldn't know without being able to speak with Jim Michael and or Joe Roberto, both of whom were on vacation last week. Regarding the reporting requirement, the semi-annual reporting requirement, I couldn't find any such condition. I asked Roland to search for it. Roland couldn't find it. I spoke further with Mrs. Tarkington, and Mrs. Tarkington explained to me that actually the circumstance was a little different. To her recollection, and my experience, Mrs. Tarkington's recollection is usually excellent, I regret to say. And she said what happened was that we were poised to impose such a condition, and the Parks and Recreation folks who were before us at that time indicated to us, you don't need to impose those conditions. We will report to you voluntarily. It's my word, not their word necessarily, at least that often. And it does seem that Mrs. Tarkington is correct that although there wasn't such a requirement therefore imposed on them, in fact, they have never come back to us with any such reporting function, and thus it does seem appropriate to me that Mrs. Tarkington's amendment be added if this board would like to have that kind of reporting coming back to it. Lastly, I would mention to you that I consulted with Al Cava regarding the existence of a grievance, and Al Cava says to me there's been no grievance filed. He knows of none, and if there were such a difficulty going on, he thinks he would have known on it. I think the grievance issue is something of a red herring. I think those are pretty detailed facts. I think we have the facts clearly before us. There is a process of planting of trees. By the way, Mr. Spayman says that he's planting approximately 300 trees a year. That to me sounded like a pretty large number, and I'm quite pleased. Maybe not all the board is, but to me that seemed like good news. I would like not to do anything that interrupts that process, and I would like to cure the problem of there being a process going on that has never been approved by the BET or the RTM. And the best way I can think of to do that is to approve the resolution that you have before you. I'm completely sympathetic to the concerns of Mrs. Tarkington that she has felt like there's been a process going on that felt somewhat out of control, and she would feel that if we had a reporting process that came back to us at least annually, that we would restore some control. I wasn't feeling like things were out of control, but I certainly have no objection to there being a process of them coming back and reporting to us annually on how the tree planting is going and what they've planted and what they've been doing. And so that's my factual report. I'm sorry to take so long, but I'm trying to be responsive.
So we get to proper order. So if you're in favor of the Tarkington amendment, you want to vote yes to the motion to amend.
Right.
Okay, so that's the first item. All those in favor of the motion to amend?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining. So that motion is now the one before us. I think we've had some discussion on that motion already. Okay, all those in favor of that motion?
This is to approve.
Further discussion, I'm sorry.
May I just make a few comments here?
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I just would like to add here that, again, I did not support this in the Law Committee because I felt the BET should have a full understanding of the implications of the proposed resolution prior to proceeding with it. And also, I did not believe the Law Committee has the jurisdiction to approve this, other than its legal sufficiency, and alternatively, that the operational issues are better handled by the Budget Committee. And I'd also add that, I do believe that the Budget Committee should be talking with this department to make sure that the appropriate insurance is in order and other things when we use outside vendors, and that the agreements really are in place and aren't creating other issues. And also that this works for the other things that we're working with the tree department, such as the Trees at Risk program and the labor issues there, and that we're dedicating the use of that labor appropriately. So I'd recommend that at some appropriate time on the Budget Committee agenda that the Budget Committee talk further with this department.
Okay. Mr. Goldrick?
Yes. I agree with Ms. Tarkington on this. I think that it was my understanding at the Law Committee meeting that this change was made in December of 2012, not 2013, and that I think they mentioned 15 months ago. So we had a change in that relationship over a long period, and now we're being asked to change the wording of this this resolution here. And as Mr. Raymer has pointed out, it may change again in the future. I think this involves sufficient funds that the BET should be consulted on this. I would like to know exactly what their plans are. Mr. Spayman did say he was very grateful for the increase in funds for more trees. So that seems to indicate, in addition to what Mr. Raymer conveyed about the unhappiness of the Tree Conservancy, that there has been some deficiencies in planting. 300 trees, given what the thousands that go down in any given storm we've had, is really a drop in the bucket. But I would like to talk to Ms. Tarkington about getting a presentation made to us. Not being on the Budget Committee, I'd appreciate it before the full BET by Mr. Spayman and also the Tree Conservancy representatives, because there's also plans going forward or supposedly in the works for arboretums that have been in the works for a long time. I would like to know when those would begin and be completed and what is involved in terms of the financing for this. It's nice to know that there are no labor grievances filed, but as we've heard, this has been changing, and I think it's a simple matter for the BET to be consultant on this. So I would go along with this resolution now, including what Ms. Harkington, her amendment, with the understanding that in the near future, these entities would come before us and explain their relationships and the funding and what they intend to do going forward. Last thing, I think Mr. Spayman mentioned that he appeared before the BET budget hearings, I think 2 or 3 years ago. That was at my behest, but not since then. So I think it's a simple matter that we should know exactly what's going on, the labor sharing and the funding.
Okay, further discussion? Okay, on item number, I'm going to call it Resolution 48 as amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Mr. Drake, did you have?
Yeah, just to make it easy for our minutes to accurately reflect the amendment, could I ask Catherine to just state one more time the sentence that was added, just so we're all squared away? Do you have it? Or would Leslie like to say it again, just to make it easy for us? Sure.
The Department of Parks and Recreation, Tree Division, will submit a report to the BET annually summarizing these contributions.
Well, I think,
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Ms. Targnan. Thank you. Just help us be organized.
It was never typed up wrong in this other.
Okay.
Okay, so next item under new business. May 19th is our full BET meeting. I've changed the starting time to 7:15. I hope that's not an inconvenience for anyone. I really appreciate it. We have a member or two with a slight conflict early on. I just want to make sure we're all here. The agenda is normally light that time of year, but that's our mill rate. That's the night we set our mill rate, so we have that. So I figured I'd put that in bold print so we have it. Old business, item number 10, internal audit posting. So let me start with, actually, very rarely I read my comments, but so we had a request to put an item on the agenda to post our internal audits. When we had that discussion that was passed, we sent that to our Policy and Procedure Committee, where I believe it had a split vote on adding that to our policy manual as an additional and/or new policy. It then went to the Audit Committee, where the committee was a 2-2 vote on that to create a new standing policy. It from there went to the Law Committee where it did not receive support, help me, Mr. Raymer, if I'm correct, to create a new standing policy. So 2 things happened after that, following those meetings. Peter Minarski did some peer community reviews, and I had scheduled a meeting with the town attorney to get more impact on this subject. To date, here's what I'm going to say what I've learned and how I see the item. We've had much more involved internal audit system than most other communities. Peter, I was shocked to find out how many communities really don't have the internal auditing, at our level. I think we're very fortunate there. It's a positive. And the town attorney has reached a conclusion that if a particular internal audit, has a direct personal performance issue or material directly commenting on a department performance or an irregularity or an employment issue, that the audit committee going forward should probably check with law before having those discussions in a public meeting, simply because there's FOI issues and what have you when you start talking about an employee's performance, especially if you start talking about it in a negative way. So after meeting with Wayne, I've come to the position where at this point in time, I don't see a need for us to add a new policy for posting internal audits. However, I also believe any member of this board can make a motion at any time to post any of our material on a web page that he or she would like. If I'm I haven't caught up with Mr. Raymer too much on this, so if I may, I'm going to ask Mr. Raymer from the Law Committee sort of position if there's anything I'm missing or anything I see. I look at it as, in my meeting with the town attorney, we've had internal audit for a dozen years, and we've never done this. So, and I don't, there was nothing that was brought to my attention statutory-wise. So, Mr. Raymer, if you could sort of maybe help from there.
Yep. The Law Committee looked at this on April 10th. Our meeting was attended by Mr. Goldrick, who had been the author of the original motion before the full BET that was tabled at that time. And the item appears on our agenda, so I guess that lifts it from the table appropriate for action. The meeting was attended by our town attorney and an assistant town attorney, and there was a lively dialogue. One needs to separate here questions that are law and questions that are policy. It's not the province of the town attorney to instruct us as to what should be our policy. That's very much in the province of the judgment of the 12 of us. So the town attorney gave us opinion with clarity as to what the law requires, and that was in terms of freedom of information obligations, of when documents must be made public and when documents may be veiled from the public review. We also then had a lively dialogue among the people present on the policy issue. That was really not something for the town attorney to opine on. And for exactly the same reason, it's not the province of the Law Committee to formulate policy for the board. It's only the province of the Law Committee to take an item that's before you and indicate what it understands to be in legal order and what it understands not to be in legal order. And so we took no formal vote as a law committee because the issue before us is this policy issue to be debated as is the pleasure of this body, to be voted on if that's the pleasure of this body. And I'm not going to share as part of a law committee report what my own personal views of it are. I will gladly do that at the moment of discussion, but the thoughts I've shared with you right now are in the nature of a law committee report, reporting on what we did and did not do.
Thank you. Discussion, further discussion. Mr. Goldrick?
I think it's very important to understand two things. First of all, these audit reports are considered public information. They are accepted in public session, voted on in public session, and therefore are in the public realm. So when I urged the BET to put these online, it was not in the sense of divulging confidential information or confidential reports. And I think it's important to reiterate what Mr. Raymer recounted, which was that Wayne Fox, our town attorney, stated that anyone can ask for these reports or issue a FOIA, and the town would have to hand them over. Mr. Chairman, when you mentioned your discussion with Wayne Fox, it was about personnel matters that would be discussed before the audit committee. And FOIA is rather explicit about that. There are instances in which if an employee is going to be named, that employee has the right to be informed beforehand and to be present and to ask for that discussion to be held either publicly or privately. But that's different from the audit report itself. By the time the report is presented to the audit committee in public session and accepted in public, it's in the public realm. So as Mr. Fox stated, this is a matter of policy, not a matter of law. There is no legal restriction keeping us from putting these reports online. And I would remind everyone that Mr. Monarski said 2 months ago that it would be a simple matter to put these reports online, to create a page for the audit committee and have them there. We talked about we had a discussion as to perhaps there might be some audits that are sensitive and that perhaps we might want to either redact some reports after they were accepted or else to keep some reports from being listed. My position is that that is a slippery slope, that who is it that will say which report, which is in the public realm, should not be put up on the town's website for the voters of this town and the taxpayers to read and see what they're doing. Who is going to be embarrassed by this? And if you start making exceptions, then who is the one who makes those exceptions and for what reasons? It's much better to say everything goes up there. I would also point out that I think it was Mr. Raymer who stated that the town puts out lots of public information. There are lots of things which are listed online. My rejoinder, however, is that these audit reports are of a different nature. They are all about what went wrong in our government, what needed fixing. And those are the sorts of things which can be sensitive, but that all people in this town should have a right to know about. As it is right now, these reports go to 12 people, the members of BET, and perhaps one additional person in the department that is affected. They are not sent to the media. Nobody else knows about this. So there is a chicken and egg here, which is that they're in the public realm, they've been presented and accepted in public session, and yet unless you're there at the audit committee meeting, people have no way of knowing what reports are there. And clearly it seems to be the policy, or has been for years, to keep this as tightly controlled as possible. And that's what we're talking about now. It is my view that this is a matter of policy and a matter of culture, that we should say, these are not secret reports. We did not present them in executive session. Information about personnel has been taken out before they get to that point. And that's the sort of thing that people in this town have a right to know about their government.
Further discussion, Mr. Norton, Mr. Raymer.
Mr. Chairman, for the last 7 years, I've been chairing the audit committee. And during that time, I set as a standard that the implementation of best business practices is our objective in everything that we do. And it is my opinion that an audit committee functions and the audit process functions best with the implementation of best business practices. I fail to understand how posting on a website disclosing something that is a public document which is available to anybody, they're identified in the minutes of committee meetings, they're identified in agendas, how this serves best business practices. I don't understand how posting these things assists the internal audit function, which is the key element of an audit committee's ability to serve its function. I am very concerned that internal audit needs to function in an investigatory manner, and that this will compromise the ability to do that. And I think that it also indicates the potential for many unintended consequences. And the last point that I'd like to make is that the Freedom of Information Act has been on the books in the state of Connecticut for more than 25 years. And there never has been any indication by the legislature, which is a very telling situation, to require that these reports be made public in this context. And I do not support the posting of these audits on our website. They're available, anybody can have them, and it doesn't take a great deal of effort to be able to secure them.
Mr. Raymer?
I think this is one of the more difficult issues that we're going to face as a BET. Although I come to a different conclusion than Mr. Goldrick, I fervently agree with the great majority of what he said. One of the most important responsibilities that we have as a BET, one of the most important responsibilities that we have as town government, is an honesty and transparency of government that justifies the public confidence in us. I also agree with Mr. Goldrick when he says that maybe not every time, but the majority of the times that we're doing an audit, it's because there is something which we think either didn't go well in the administration of town government or may not have gone well. And so these audit reports are in large measure the frank, honest disclosure to our public of the mistakes that we made and the steps that we're seeking to take to correct these things. I also agree with Mr. Goldrick and respectfully disagree with Mr. Norton that for John Q. Public out there, the fact that something took place on an agenda that was never brought to the citizens' attention and that a report is sitting in some box somewhere in the first selectman's office or in the town clerk's office hardly brings to the citizens' attention that there's a report out there that he really dearly would like to see. He just doesn't know it's there, and there's an important difference with that. And I like very much the metaphor that Mr. Goldrick picked, that this is a slippery slope, that you have this difficulty that if you're not going to disclose absolutely everything, then you're in this very awkward thing of who is deciding what gets disclosed and how is that done. Nevertheless, as a practical matter, it quickly comes to mind for me recent examples of things where we have conducted audits and it would be dearly harmful to the best purposes of the town and its citizenry if these things were disclosed. So, for example, we had a town employee that left making accusations about the honesty of the handling of another town employee, and there were reciprocal allegations back and forth. And as we looked at it, at immediate blush, it was clear to us that we had been paying for services and material by a vendor in which those services for a very long period of time had not been rendered. And it was unclear to us who was dishonest, how many dishonest people are there, and by the way, how many of those vendors out there that were billing us for services and materials never supplied. And had we made each of these internal interim audits public, we would have preempted our ability to try and get to the bottom of who are our honest and dishonest employees and who are the vendors out there that are corrupt that we should not be dealing with. It was a clear example of an audit that the right judgment would be not to make that one public, at least not for a fairly protracted period of time until we know we've gotten to the bottom of every element of that. We more recently had an episode in which we were investigating another arm in which there were funds being received that were not under the usual close supervision of the finance department. And we conducted an audit, and there was dismay and upset when that interim audit was divulged to the media. The media never ran an article on it, but our concern there, too, was whether or not it now preempts our ability to understand more fully what's right and what's wrong in those divisions. I'm sorry to speak so euphemistically, but I don't want to, in this public forum, talk about specific names and things of the events, but I think for the 12 of us, we're remembering. So how do I deal with this slippery slope? I think at the end of the day, with great trepidation, I reach a mildly different conclusion than Mr. Goldrick. I endorse entirely the extreme need for us to always serve transparency of government. I will eagerly support on an episode-by-episode basis putting forward onto a website or any other measure that I can do to make these audit reports public. but I'm not willing to adopt a standing policy that all reports have to be public. I don't even want to have a standing policy that they'll all be public unless we resolve on a case-by-case basis not to make something public, because the very airing of the discussion here of the reason why we don't want to make a particular audit public will, in my opinion, in itself sour our ability to get to the bottom of some of the issues. And so I'm finding this a very difficult subject matter for me, but at the end of the day, the point that I personally come to is I think we should be putting almost all of these audits onto the website, exactly as Mr. Goldrick is saying, but I wish to do that in a way in which we have not inaugurated a standing policy of publishing them all on the website, except in those cases where we make an exception and decide not to, because I don't want to articulate the last piece. And that's my personal view on it.
Mr. Blankley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suspect I'm the only member of this board who has actually been an internal auditor. I was actually Deputy Chief Internal Auditor for a major group for 2 years in my corporate life. So I can speak to that experience and best business practice. Best business practice is to have, in the first instance, an internal audit department, and its purpose is to ensure that processes are conducted properly and to ensure that we have proper internal controls. Now, by its nature, an internal audit is something that is going to find deficiencies, and that means inevitably that since organizations are made up of people, that maybe some people have been deficient. Now, in a commercial organization, all of that information is held internally and acted upon internally. In a municipal setting, it's different. This is a situation where anybody involved in a municipal organization as an employee or volunteers, as we are, needs to be aware of the need for transparency in the things that they do. So I believe that best business practice would suggest that, contrary to the idea that some information may be made available that might make it more difficult to investigate, I would suggest a better way to look at it is that having an internal audit department and having audit reports made public is actually a good way to ensure that bad things don't happen. In other words, if you're going to misbehave in some fashion or other as a contractor or as someone in the town dealing with a contractor, for example, be it known that the internal audit department will get you in the end. And I think that's a good thing. And I think also that if reports are made public, then that will be a good way to achieve that. Now, in the Audit Committee, I supported a motion by my colleague, Mr. Finger, which allowed for the withholding of some reports on the basis of their sensitivity. And the idea was that I can't remember exactly who, either the town attorney or the law department or whoever else should withhold a report. Listening to Mr. Goldrick, I have been persuaded by his argument that, in fact, the slippery slope point is the important one here. And I just don't see how we can get round that notion. In other words, where I'm coming out on this is get it all out there. Transparency is paramount.
Nancy Weissler?
I just wanted a point of clarification, since this is a new issue for me, with the exception of our prior discussion. Am I right in understanding that the town attorney has said that all of them are accessible from a request, sort of FOI?
Yes.
All of them? Yes. So, I mean, in terms of Mr. Goldrick's point, the public has a right to know. It seems like we are meeting the public's right to know. Anyone can go to the audit committee meetings. Anyone can look at the minutes, and upon request, they have access to them. I mean, I guess I feel like we are satisfying. I personally, having looked at what I've seen forthcoming from the audit committee, think that, this is a very valuable function. I think the information is very useful, but I feel the information is accessible. I realize you could argue putting it online makes it slightly more accessible, but I guess I'm not necessarily seeing that nuance is important.
Sean, anybody else? Sean Goldrick?
Yeah, I would reiterate, these are public documents. They've already been accepted. There's nothing confidential about these, nothing in executive session. To Ms. Weissler's point, and to Mr. Norton's, you can show up at an audit committee meeting and listen to this, but how many of our 61,230 residents are going to show up to the audit committee meeting? With the few reporters we have left in town, they don't show up to the audit committee meeting. The last time I saw a reporter show up, he promptly fell asleep. So we're not getting that coverage. I would just take issue with what Mr. Norton said, which is, on the one hand, he said, this is all public, the titles are there in the audit committee's minutes, but on the other hand, putting it on the website would damage that function itself. Well, it can't be both. If these are public, readily accessible to the public, then there is no issue with any damaging of the internal audit function. But I think the real truth is that these are very closely held. People don't go to the audit committee meetings at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning once a month. The paper doesn't report about it, and you don't know what's in these reports. And in terms of the function, I think actually the internal auditor's function would be strengthened by having these more readily available. I think there are a lot of reports that people would be furious about what happened and very interested in what was going on in their government if they had access to it and more readily accessible and knew exactly what was going on in there. And they have a right to know. The old expression, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if I were a reporter worth my salt, if we started listing some of these and then held some back, the first thing I would do as a reporter would be to ask for that report that was held back. That might not be what Greenwich Time does going forward, but I think that by the time it's accepted publicly by the audit committee, any issues in terms of personnel or illegality or the like have already been dealt with within the committee. So I would urge this us to actually make it a policy. And again, Wayne Fox did say this is not a legal matter. He has no problems in terms of the legality of putting these on them. It's a matter of policy, and I would say a matter of open government.
Tom Blakely, you had your hand up?
Just briefly, I was reacting a little bit to Ms. Weiss's point about all this information already being available through FOI. I would use the best business practice point to counter that and say best business practice is actually to get ahead of the game and get it out there.
Mr. Chair, just a quick question, and perhaps either Mr. Minarski or members of the Audit Committee can clarify. When you review one of these reports in open session, not in executive session, are names protected at that point in time?
We would go into executive session if there were names that would have liabilities attached to them, but we have not had to do that.
And when reports are finalized and voted on by the Audit Committee, presumably in open session, confidential information is redacted at that point, or not?
It would be. If there were confidential information, yes, it would be. Yes, it would be. It would be.
I'm not aware of any report ever being redacted.
I haven't. I'm not either, but I would insist that as chair of the committee, I would insist that they be redacted if there was confidential information included in the audit.
Okay,
personally.
Mr. Chairman. One second. Let me ask one question first. Audit committee, there's a dozen of these a year. This is what we're talking about. And the audit committee works on these internal audits sort of on a remember, I've always started going to the audit committee in the last term here. They work on these internal audits on a sort of a step-by-step progress, things in motion, and they're all marked draft.
Well, no, we authorize the internal audit function, which is made up of two individuals, Ron Liley and Pat Marinan, to complete a report,
Gotcha.
to complete an audit.
But you get updates along the way.
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't.
Okay, but those are marked draft. So I was in the audit committee last week, and Ron had one, it was marked draft, and he says, look, I've got 32 more things to plug into this, but I'm just giving you an update where I'm at, how I'm doing, that kind of thing.
They're in effect draft until we accept them. At that point, they'd be converted.
Okay. Does the audit, I'm just going to get to my real question now. Does the audit committee approve these, or is it the BET?
The audit committee approves them as agent for the full board.
Bill, and I'll get to Sean.
In response to your questions, and Art, correct me if I'm wrong, I think because of I had been on the audit committee maybe 4 years ago, and I'm back on now. In my previous tenure on the audit committee, I did see interim reports.
Right.
We went over them. My understanding or my sense is that because of the incident that happened in one of the reports where an interim report was presented and then got to the media before the report was accepted and finalized, the internal auditor is more cautious about presenting what we'll call interim reports. So my experience in this term has been that he has presented to the audit committee what he's working on, generally just verbally telling us what he's working on, where he is where he and Pat Manahan are in their field work, and that maybe in the next meeting or the subsequent meeting they'll get back to us with their actual report. So I have not seen an interim report document. I think we'll probably just be seeing what I guess would be considered a final document. And in terms of what action we take, the action that we're asked by the internal auditor is, is this okay to release to the full BET? And when we have accepted it, in a sense, we say yes, release it to the full BET. And I deem that to be when we have a completed audit. And for example, and you look back in minutes of our April meeting, we did just that with one of the internal auditor reports.
Mr. Chairman?
I'm trying to think of my question. Mr. Goldrick.
I'll answer a couple of questions. First, in terms of interim versus final reports, in my experience, it depends on the report itself. There are short ones and there are long ones. So some quickie audits will be done and finished, and a report will be there. Some of them have taken several months, so you might get an interim report. But I would point out that almost invariably, the interim reports are also presented in open session. Anybody can come in and listen and take notes or what have you. And according to FOIA, we are required to hold these in open sessions, except for very limited circumstances, which gets to Ms. Kiernan's question about personnel. And I'm going to mangle this a bit, but it lays out if an employee is named or substantially identified in a discussion before a government entity and their performance is being discussed, that employee must be notified that the meeting is coming up. And that employee has the right to make it either public or private and to attend.
That's what Wayne was focused on with me.
That's right. And that is before
Wayne Fox.
a final report. So that's very carefully laid out. That rarely seems to well, only on a couple of occasions. And those matters are dealt with before a final report is brought out.
One of the other steps that I just didn't get to work is we were supposed to have, at the very end of March, an FOI session with one of the state commissioners from the FOI to come down. I don't know if anybody caught that. They actually scheduled that for the boards and commissions in town on a Saturday, and it was a sort of a lackluster response to that.
I was that.
Yeah, it wasn't well attended, and we got the notice literally that week. That wasn't really supposed to be ours. Ours was set up by Wayne, not the Office of the First Selectman. But I didn't get to that yet. But so let's step away for a second. Let's deal with the slippery slope comments. There's no slippery slope. We're having this conversation right here. There's no slippery slope. There's advice coming from sort of, I'll say from sitting in the center of this, from both sides. We don't have a policy. We don't have a motion for a policy. We have members saying, look, this needs to be looked at as we go. I can tell you one of my very first audit committees, and I'll look at Mr. Finger, and I'm sure he remembers it very well, where there was some new technology put into place in town that kept track of certain thing with vehicles. And I can assure you that information, what was the term that you used? I think when you were using your terminology there. But I mean, that's led to improvements, enhancements, and what have you. And I just think that, again, these are about a dozen a year, the short ones and the long ones combined, roughly. Is that what we're talking about? So I don't think it's an issue for us to get them from the audit committee and make a motion for posting. I don't even know what we would post them under. Do we have an audit committee tab even?
There's an internal auditor tab.
We have one of those?
Under finance.
We can develop an internal audit site, but it would probably be in the audit committee section.
Who would do that tab development?
Elaine. And she would just basically put the audits on the website.
I believe it's, checking my trusty iPad here.
Audit committee section.
Yeah, there is an audit committee.
It's not there.
That's where the minutes and the agendas are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's under, it's under Finance Committee, under Finance Department. There's under the Finance Department, there's an internal audit tab.
And all of them, everything is on the audit committee agenda, so that's posted anyway, so that's already out there. So they're already posted.
The internal audit reports?
No, the audit committee monthly agenda.
Yes.
And minutes, it's already posted. So it's really already on there anyway. It's just, this is
And once they're approved in the minutes.
it says it.
Even before the minutes are approved, because that takes a month, the standing order is that once Arts Committee approves it, they're sent to the 12 BET members.
So,
Mr. Chairman.
if somebody, I'll get there, okay, go ahead, Mr. Rimmer.
Yeah, it concerns me that we not trivialize this. There is a difference between an agenda being published that talks about the audit of a particular department, and the concern isn't satisfied by there simply being minutes that say that internal auditor Ron Lally briefed the committee on the results of the internal audit of the XYZ department. And the fact that somebody can see that agenda won't twig them to come. The fact that they can access those minutes won't twig them to come. It is not a trivial issue. On the other side of the coin, I took a few minutes here just to go through Article 1-200 in the Connecticut General Statutes. If you do an audit and discover in the course of your audit that there has clearly been defalcation of funds by at least one of possibly 4 or 5 different employees, and clearly been remittances milked by the town by 2 or 3 contractors with the town, those are not facts that you're privileged under FOI to keep to yourself. They can become public documents. And yet the fact that that's divulged to you in an initial audit, you could call it a final audit or not, leaves on your plate that there are unresolved issues here. And the only thing that seems to be protected by FOI is that FOI does not allow the citizen to requisition from the police department the names of witnesses and evidences in a case that's in preparation if you're not the defendant yourself. And yet for us as a town, when you're developing that and protecting yourself against continuing harm, I think the town has a vested interest in perhaps, at least not for the moment, divulging those facts. But this is certainly not a trivial issue. There is very definitely the slippery slope that those of us who, out of our selfishness, want to protect our public appearance as public servants or whatever, we could easily be motivated to try and hide from this nice reporter sitting at the back of the room the features of our job that we did poorly. And you need to be careful of both sides of the equation. This is a thorny issue, and you need to be respectful of the fact that there's right in both sides of this argument, and you need to find, each of us for himself, need to find our track down through this difficult area. For some of us, we find ourselves way off on one side, for others, way off on the other side. For most of us, I think we're somewhere in the middle. This is a very difficult issue, and it gets right to the heart of our doing right by our jobs and not being afraid to allow people to criticize the way in which to do our jobs.
Mr. Finger? I'll get to Mr.
Jeff, just for clarification, we have a very capable minute taker in our audit committee meetings, Elaine Brown.
Okay.
And I assure you that she doesn't gloss over comments made about internal audit reports. If you look at the minutes, she doesn't sugarcoat any of the findings in there. So, just in defense of Elaine.
Having served on the committee, I'm now beginning to record her minutes. You're right. She's very detailed, and she can be absolutely merciless. I agree with you.
Okay, Mr. Norton?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to some comments that recently made in directly relating to what we're doing here. And actually, the internal audit function is a process. And I don't think we're trying to hide anything, and I don't think that that's the intent of anybody. What I think is necessary to protect is the process. And a policy addresses process. And if we were to have a policy, then what we're doing is specifically addressing the internal audit function process. And I think the integrity of that process is what is key to making that function operate and provide us what we want to have it do. And as soon as we, in any way, are mitigating the ability for the process to function at its highest level, then we have an unintended consequence, which I don't think that we're considering in this discussion.
Mr. Goldrick?
If I may. We're talking about defending the process here, but if the process leads to a report that most people don't even know exists, is that a process which leads to, the best outcomes, especially if we're looking at, areas where we're trying to reform our town government? It would seem that that process would be enhanced by people having greater access to those results, to understanding what's going on. And just to Mr. Raymer's point in terms of criminality, I do recall one or two occasions when that was an issue, and those audits were discussed, or the interim findings of those audits and progress reports were discussed in executive session. And only after those questions of illegality or police involvement were concluded did it become public information. So I think the audit committee has been very careful about that, and it's a rare occurrence.
Mr. Chairman, the only time we had an executive session in the audit committee was when a request was made to perform an audit, and the basis in that request was made. There's only been one instance that I can recall in the 7 years that we've had an executive session in the audit committee.
Okay. So let me put a spin. When this first came up, my original answer was, gee, I never knew we did post-internal audits. That's why I took on the initiative and said, sounds interesting. Let's see where this goes. I want to go on a record opposite to what you think. I think some of the work that's come out of our internal audits has protected the town, saved the town, enhanced government services, has been good for all of the community in general. However, I still believe that the item is posted on the agenda. It's labeled the Peter Minarski audit. The minutes, even if the minutes label approval of the Peter Minarski audit, okay? Forget FY. Anybody could easily, very quickly, just call up Peter and say, can you send me that audit? I mean, there's nothing to this here. This is very simple, okay? Very simple. Just call up Peter Minarski and say, hey, the audit committee, what was that Peter Minarski audit? Can you send me a copy of that? And it's noticed, and when it's complete, which is when it becomes public, and I agree with everything that I'm hearing, when it's approved by, that's why I asked the question, the audit committee, it's public at that point in time. And when the minutes reflect that, then somebody could say, hey, what's this Peter Minarski audit about? And I would think, I don't know how the town webpage works as well as some of us here, but I think if you wanted to search audit, anything to do with William Finger and the audit, you could just search it. When it pops up, you have it. I think we're already there. I mean, I think it's just, you get our agendas, correct?
Yeah.
You get emails from finance?
No emails. They show up when they are
No, but you get notice of all of our meetings.
Yes.
You get notified, and the link is there to the agenda. So the Peter Minarski audit is there. So you go, what's this about? Okay, when it's approved, you see that in the minutes. If you follow that committee, you say, hey, that's approved. You call Peter, say, can I have a copy of that audit? I think we're there. I think I agreed with Mr. Raymer originally. I think that we need to, the lesson that I learned out of this, and maybe I didn't get that message across, came from the law department saying, look, if anything you're doing in there, and I'm quoting what you're saying too, Sean, anything you're doing there that specifically talks about an employee's performance, that employee has FOI privileges and rights. And I think we all agree with that. So my point is, I think the stuff is already posted there. I think it's there. It's there for anybody who wants it. It's not that we're just not posting the audit itself. I don't think that's the question. I think we're noticing it. We're authorizing it. It's there. We're getting updates, and when it's finally approved, I think it's noticed that it's approved. So I'm not trying to take this lightly, but I think that this is a policy, and I think that's what our current policy has been for a decade or so since we've been doing these. That's just how I see it. Mr. Drake?
We're talking here about transparency and effectiveness of our government, and I think it's important to keep in mind the audit committee is like our lead functionary in that. We're very pleased to have an audit committee. It's got members of both parties on it. We have confidence in the things that Artie's digging into and Bill is digging into and Leslie and John. So there should be no ask or any opinion that anything's being hidden. As a matter of fact, the spotlight and the scrubbing is done by the 4 people you have elected to carry out this task, and they're carrying it out well. That's why they do what they do. You should be pleased with what they do. I think, and also you're not talking about your own access to anything. If you're sitting at this table, you have access to everything they do. And if you're a citizen of the town, you have access to everything they do. It's all there. We're having a discussion about how easy do we make it for the media to bring it to the attention of 62,000 people. That's not an audit function. You have a committee that's carrying out an independent, thorough audit function, and it's available to everyone. So I think, for those reasons, I'm going to vote to maintain the current policy. I think that if I were on the audit committee and I was working on something and I knew that some of my half-completed work or even my completed work was going to be posted and then take another direction through the media, it will affect the way you do your job. And I think you can do your job, like a lot of jobs, more effectively, confidentially, until your work is complete, and then it's authorized for distribution to everyone. So for those reasons, I'm going to vote to maintain the current policy.
If I could just add one more comment. There were a number of occasions over the past 2.5 years in which the audit committee did go into executive session. But if it is the case that these are freely available, actually, I'm not looking to facilitate or make it easier for the press themselves necessarily to get these reports, because they should be doing it anyway, but average citizens and taxpayers to make it easier for them. Because when they look at, if they go into the audit agenda and say, harbor master something or other, most of them won't know. But if there is a page and they know, if something is going on in government, I can go and find out what these things are here. So we have kind of a contradiction here. If this is freely available and everybody has access, then and the audit function is working, then there is no problem with making it even more accessible. That won't damage that function. So I would like it, again, to get back to the fact that there is no legal problem here. It is all public information. Anyone can come there, but just to make it easier for people in this town to know what we're doing and to know what products are and how their government is functioning, good and bad. And there are areas where things come out really well and some areas where not so well. I think people have a right to both of those. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make the motion that we post, as a matter of policy, completed audits on the town website.
Hang on one second.
Not that it makes a difference, Mr. Chairman, but the motion actually was already on the table and seconded. And when you put it on the agenda, you lifted it from the table. So that it doesn't require the fresh motion. It didn't require the second. The motion before us was to, as I recall, was to inaugurate the policy of posting on the town website all audits.
Okay, so then this would be a vote, as I understand it, to have the Policy and Procedure Committee draft a policy for all internal audits to be posted, to be brought back to us for a vote.
Say that again, Mr. Chairman.
This would be a motion that the Policy and Procedure Committee draft a resolution to be brought back to the full BET to post all internal audits on the webpage, wherever that webpage is, or where, somewhere under the audit committee, which would probably be pretty clearly defined in the policy language. But that's the motion that I would understand is on the table.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I don't see a reason for going through the policy committee. It's already been discussed by audit, by the law committee, which is where you sent it originally. And unless I've got my Robert's rules wrong, as Mr. Raymer pointed out, it has been put before the BET previously. It's been seconded. So I think.
Thank you. Mr. Finger was first, or Ms. Kiernan?
So this goes back to my earlier question and also to the language that Mr. Goldrick just proposed. He said completed audits. And my earlier question asked, are completed audits that are voted on by the audit committee redacted? And I think I heard one thing from Art, and I think I heard something else from Pete. Anybody else want to comment on what the state of those completed voted on audits are before the audit committee? Are they redacted or not? Are they already scrubbed of confidential information, whether they be police related or employment and performance related? And are they ready for public view or are they not?
The answer to your question is we haven't had that in the last 7 years. So there has been no need to redact.
I served on it for 2 years. I never saw anything redacted from an audit.
So let me go then to the discussion of the motion that was made at the audit committee, because I believe the audit, and Mr. Finger maybe can speak to this, the audit committee voted on a motion to post these reports, but not when they have confidential information contained in them. So can you speak further to the point of that?
The motion that was made, that I made at the audit committee in March, that Mr. Blankley seconded, and which John alluded to in his comments earlier, was that, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit because there was a typo error in it. that with the exception of the audit reports that the town attorney, the BET Law Committee, the BET Audit Committee, and the minutes say "and," but actually the motion was "or internal auditor believe are of a confidential nature that could have an impact on a personnel issue, that all other audits, at least on an annual basis, be listed on the internal audit page of the Town of Greenwich website." That was the motion that was made at the Audit Committee and failed 2-2.
Be listed. Not posted, but listed.
No. The intent was that it be posted, listed and posted.
Mr. Chairman, if I could answer that question. I agree with Mr. Norton on this one. I think when there is a question of police involvement or confidential personnel records, those issues are dealt with before the audit is completed. So I have not seen a completed audit where Mr. Lally says, we can't let anyone see this because we've got these confidential elements here. Nor have I seen any report, as Mr. Raymer stated, where something was redacted there were two final versions of a report. So I would just say that I appreciate Mr. Finger's motion during the Audit Committee, but mine is something different. And because I don't think there is an issue of confidentiality or personnel confidentiality in these completed reports, I don't think that final step is necessary.
Okay, so just for the record, the motion to post these, I will not support this motion. Let me just, so I'm very clear why. We have a policy and procedure manual which follows a format. For those of us who have spent time on that committee in our term on the BET, anything that we do should follow that format, and these questions should be answered, like the detail of that motion. So just to have to vote on a blanket to post completed audits to the town website, I can't support that. So
that's the motion.
If I may, Sean, if you consider this, and this is a question I had when you, Mike, first indicated that this would be a motion, if it was approved, to then go back to the Policy and Procedures Committee to draft something.
Right.
Were you? I hope you were not, or I don't think you were suggesting that if we were to vote in favor of this motion, that it would then go back to Policies and Procedures, and then there would be another bite at the apple.
Well, I think
it was just language you want.
No, I think that should come back to us with the details like you're talking about in that motion that was in the Audit Committee. I think it should be very clear what, when, how, and follow our normal procedures. But the idea is if you send it to the committee to do it under the terms that you read from what was proposed in the committee, then it's the committee's job to come back, and we're in favor of it. It's just to get the language the right way.
I am one of the members of the Policies and Procedures Committee. I will tell you that if the motion that Sean made that is before us now is approved, then the language that would come back would be that motion. It wouldn't be
Correct.
the language that I had. Right. So
I
don't want anybody to think that there'd be any, at least from my standpoint, I wouldn't be tinkering with the language. It would right. basically be
and I don't think
language.
That the motion before us has the detail that meets our standards in our policy procedure manual right off the bat. Mr. Raymer?
In light of the fact that we've discussed this now for about an hour, I'm going to propose, I know the chair doesn't like call the question, but I'm going to propose that we bring Mr. Goldrick's motion seconded, lifted from
Actually,
the table.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield for one question?
I'm speaking, if I may.
Would he yield for one question?
Mr. Raymer?
I'll yield.
I wonder, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman,
from South Carolina.
Are you saying that if this proposal goes to the Policy and Procedure Committee,
they're to bring back language that meets.
If they bring back my language, that you will support it if it goes through?
No, your motion is to just post completed audits on the town website. That's your motion.
Let me resume my remarks if I can. I'm going to propose that we bring Mr. Goldrick's motion to a vote. In the event that the motion fails, I'm going to propose a motion that we ask either the Policy and Procedures Committee or perhaps some other committee that the chair may appoint to look at this in a more thoughtful way and come back with a somewhat slightly more moderate suggestion that may track the difficult middle ground. But rather than continue to debate points of view beyond the hour that we've already been here, I think it's time that we brought Mr. Goldrick's motion to a vote.
Okay. On the motion to post completed audits on the town website, I'm going to call it the Goldrick motion. All those in favor? Aye. Raise hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 in favor. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm missing one vote. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you get 5, 7, 0? Mr. Raymer, I will recognize you for your motion.
I would like to propose to the chair, if I may. I don't think it's a motion, but I'd like to propose to the chair that the chair appoint a special committee for the purpose of looking at this subject matter and proposing some language for a policy that addresses directly the policy of the BET for the posting of audit reports.
Okay. Mr. Finger?
Can I make a suggestion that that instead of having a special committee, that it just go to the Policies and Procedures Committee and let us discuss it, and hopefully we can find, or, well, we can have that discussion.
That's certainly
I would
sounds
ask you,
fine to me.
I'll take it one step better. I would ask you if you would be so kind, as I will ask the Policy Procedure Committee to do that. I really like to follow our current policy procedure manual, and I would also say that as long as you keep it nonpartisan, if you want to bring 2 other members in to help on that, because that's only a 2-person committee. So that's you and Mr. Norton. Okay? So I would definitely honor that. And I can't emphasize to you enough the amount of work that's going into our policies and procedure manual over time to be consistent. And I think there's a lot of good questions here, and I think we can get it into a policy and go from there. So we will do that. Should we try to have a date before call it?
I don't want to speak for.
I know we have May coming up, June.
I don't want to speak for Mr. Norton. Yeah, certainly by June.
Okay.
I mean, I don't do it.
Okay. Approval of BET minutes for March 17th.
So moved.
Do I have a second? Second. Mr. Raymer, Ms. Tarkington, all those in favor? Aye. BET public hearing, March 18th.
So moved again.
Second.
Moved and seconded it. All those in favor?
Aye.
BET decision meeting minutes, March 20th.
And one more time.
Second.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Mr. Drake, and I know Mr. Drake has a couple comments tonight. Chairman's report on minutes.
I don't have any comments.
Oh,
on
I
that.
thought you had some comments about the
Oh,
cloud
no.
and.
No. Let us keep working on that with our new IT director, and that one's not ready for prime time.
Okay. Mr. Norton?
No, I have nothing to report.
I have 3 items. First of all, I cannot thank everybody enough for your commitment to get our budget, I call it our budget, to the RTM. We met with the committees and districts ahead of the normal May cycle. I truly think it was appreciated. I have a handout here tonight, which is nothing different than you've seen before, for the upcoming month with the districts. And what I will ask is if you go to a district, especially if there's a district that needs information or what's going on, please communicate to us so we can obviously ask finance to send out any material that's needed. I think there's probably a fair amount of lively topics that are still going on. But again, everybody who put in a lot of time on that, I really appreciate it. I will be attending a land use roundtable meeting towards the end of this month. It's something new. It's not called by me. I look forward to the meeting of all the town leaders that pertain to land use to sort of have a first time ever I think it's something that's a start, and some of us that have been in the RTM and the BET for a long time might think this is a little bit long overdue. I'm looking at Mr. Huffman down there. So I will attend that, and if that turns into any kind of working group or something like that, I'll see if I can hand that off. I've also asked Mr. Norton to help Peter Tessie, who has asked for some help on the communications for Northwest Fire Station property investigation. As you know, there's a property owner that did contact us, and I think they were away, and I think it'll start this week coming up. So I've asked Mr. Norton to kind of go with Peter on that. Hopefully we'll have something on that within a month or so on that. And that's basically all I have. May is coming up. It's going to be an incredibly busy month, RTM-wise, and our call, and so let's just go to it. And again, for those who covered, I can't remember who it was, but I know some other people covered when some other conflicts came up, and I really appreciate that. So again, I can't thank everybody enough. Mr. Blankley.
Can I make an inquiry? Who is the kind and thoughtful soul that we can thank for that?
The Easter Bunny. How many people already ate them? You have no willpower.
No willpower, man.
No willpower.
Wait, we need, you stole a fellow member. She wasn't looking.
Wait a minute, who stole?
I ate mine, then I ate Leslie.
Let the minutes reflect that Jeff Raymer stole Leslie Tarkington's chocolate.
We need an audit.
All those in favor?
Good.
Thank you.